Karoline Leavitt wasn't someone who usually did things out of the ordinary. She lived a quiet life, worked a steady job, and spent her weekends catching up on books or taking long walks in the park. But everything changed one rainy afternoon, when she stumbled upon something that turned her world upside down. It all started with an old shoebox tucked away in the corner of her mother's attic. Karoline had been helping clean out the space after her mom decided it was time to declutter. The box looked unassuming, just a plain cardboard container covered in dust. But there was something about it that caught her eye. Maybe it was the way it sat slightly apart from the other items, as if it didn't belong with the rest of the forgotten junk. Curiosity got the better of her, and she reached for it. Inside, she found a collection of mementos, faded photographs, ticket stubs from concerts decades ago, and a few handwritten notes. Most of it seemed random, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. But then, buried beneath everything else, she saw it. A yellowed envelope with her father's name written across the front in shaky handwriting. Her heart skipped a beat. Her father, Richard Leavitt, had passed away years earlier, and though she remembered him fondly, there were still gaps in what she knew about his life. He rarely spoke about his work, and whenever she asked questions, as a child he would simply smile and say, "Some stories are better left untold." At the time, she accepted his answer without thinking much of it. But now, holding this letter in her hands, she couldn't help but wonder if those untold stories held secrets far bigger than she could have imagined. The envelope wasn't sealed, so she carefully opened it and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, as if whoever wrote it had been in a hurry. As she read through the lines, her eyes widened with every word. It mentioned something called Project Starlight, and warned her father to be careful because they're watching. There were no names, no clear explanations, just vague hints at danger and mystery. Karoline sat back on her heels, staring at the letter in disbelief. Who was watching? And what exactly was Project Starlight? More importantly, why had her father never told her about any of this? Questions swirled in her mind, each one pulling her deeper into a web of uncertainty. She felt a mix of emotions, curiosity, fear, and even anger. Anger not just at the unknown forces hinted at in the letter, but also at herself for not asking more questions while her father was still alive. That night, unable to sleep, Karoline made a decision. If the answers lay hidden somewhere, she was going to find them. She thought about where to start. The letter had mentioned the FBI, so maybe they could shed some light on what her father had been involved in. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead she had. The next morning, armed with nothing but the letter and a growing sense of determination, Karoline drove to the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. She had never been there before, and as she approached the towering building, she couldn't help but feel intimidated. The glass doors reflected the sunlight, making the structure look almost impenetrable. Inside, the lobby buzzed with activity. People rushed past her, talking in hushed tones while others typed furiously on laptops or answered phone calls. For a moment, Karoline hesitated. What if no one believed her? What if they turned her away without giving her a chance to explain? Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself why she was here. This wasn't just about satisfying her curiosity. It was about understanding her father's past and uncovering the truth behind the cryptic warning in the letter. She walked up to the reception desk, clutching the envelope tightly in her hand. The woman behind the counter gave her a polite but skeptical look. "How can I help you?" she asked. "I need to speak to someone," Karoline replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I think my father used to work with the FBI, and I found something, well, strange. Something that might be important." The receptionist raised an eyebrow but nodded and asked her to wait. After a few minutes, another person appeared. A tall man in a suit with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. He introduced himself as Agent Harris and gestured for her to follow him to a private room. As they sat down, Karoline handed over the letter, explaining how she'd found it and what it said. For a moment, Agent Harris simply studied the paper, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You don't know how big this is," he said finally, his tone grave. "Your father was part of something, complicated. Let me see what I can do." And with that, Karoline realized she was stepping into a world far beyond anything she'd ever imagined. Agent Harris didn't waste any time. After glancing at the letter, he stood up and motioned for Karoline to follow him. "Come with me," he said, his voice low but firm. Karoline hesitated for a split second. This was the FBI after all, and she wasn't sure what to expect, but her curiosity outweighed her nerves. She got up and trailed behind him as he led her through a maze of hallways. The building felt alive, buzzing with energy. People moved quickly, their faces focused, some carrying folders or laptops. Phones rang in the distance, and the hum of conversation filled the air. It was overwhelming, but Karoline tried to focus on the task at hand. She noticed how Agent Harris walked briskly, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. He didn't say much, just kept moving forward, occasionally glancing back to make sure she was still following. After a few minutes, they reached a door marked "Restricted Access." Agent Harris swiped a card and the door clicked open. Inside was a smaller room, quieter than the bustling hallways outside. There was a desk, a couple of chairs, and a large filing cabinet pushed against one wall. The atmosphere felt heavier here, more serious. Karoline's heart started to race again. What was about to happen? "Have a seat," Agent Harris said, gesturing toward one of the chairs. He sat down across from her and opened a drawer in the desk, pulling out a thick folder. The label on the front read, "Project Starlight," in bold letters, but it was stamped with "classified" in red ink. Karoline's stomach tightened. This was real. Whatever her father had been involved in, it wasn't just some small side project. It was something big enough to be locked away. Agent Harris flipped through the pages slowly, his eyes scanning the contents. "Your father, Richard Leavitt," he began, pausing for a moment as if to let the name sink in. "He worked with us for a short period back in the late 1980s. We brought him in because of his expertise in cryptography." Karoline frowned. Cryptography? That sounded like something out of a spy movie, not her dad's world. Sure, he'd always been good with numbers and puzzles. He used to challenge her with riddles when she was younger, but she never imagined he'd applied those skills to anything like this. "He helped us decode intercepted messages," Agent Harris continued. "Some of them were linked to national security threats. It was sensitive work, highly confidential. But then, his voice trailed off and he looked at her carefully as if deciding how much to reveal. "But then what?" Karoline pressed, leaning forward slightly. Her hands gripped the edge of the chair, her knuckles turning white. Agent Harris sighed. Then he disappeared. Just vanished without a trace. No explanation, no warning. One day he was here, working, on the project, and the next, gone. We tried to track him down, but it was like he'd fallen off the face of the earth. Karoline felt a chill run down her spine. Disappeared? That didn't sound like her father at all. He was a responsible man, someone who valued family above everything else. If he had left, wouldn't he have told her and her mother? Wouldn't he have found a way to explain? "What happened to the project?" she asked, her voice barely above, a whisper. "Did you shut it down?" Agent Harris shook his head. "No, we couldn't. Not completely. But things changed after your father left. The operation was scaled back, and eventually, it was shelved altogether. Too many unanswered questions, too many risks involved." Karoline's mind raced. Unanswered questions. Risks. Those words kept echoing in her head. Was that why her father had left? Had he discovered something dangerous? Something that forced him to walk away? And if so, what had become of him afterward? As if reading her thoughts, Agent Harris leaned closer. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice even further. "I don't know what your father was trying to tell you with this letter, but I can tell you one thing. Project Starlight wasn't just about decoding messages. There were rumors, whispers really, about something bigger going on behind the scenes. Something that made people uneasy." "What kind of rumors?" Karoline asked, her pulse quickening. Agent Harris hesitated, clearly weighing his words. Let's just say there were concerns about who else might have been involved. High-level connections, powerful people who didn't want certain truths coming to light. Karoline felt a lump form in her throat. This was getting darker by the minute. Her father hadn't just stumbled into something secretive. He'd been part of something potentially explosive. And now, decades later, she was sitting in the middle of it, holding a piece of the puzzle in her hands. Before she could ask another question, Agent Harris closed the folder and stood up. "That's all I can share for now," he said firmly. "But if you're serious about finding answers, I'll take you somewhere that might help." Karoline nodded eagerly, though a part of her was nervous. Wherever they were going, it was clear that things were about to get even more complicated. Still, she didn't hesitate. She needed to know the truth, not just for herself, but for her father. Whatever secrets lay buried in the past, she was determined to dig them up. Agent Harris led her back into the hallway and down another corridor. This one was narrower, with dimmer lighting. The walls were lined with doors, each one labeled with numbers and codes. They stopped in front of one marked Vault 7. Again, he swiped his card, and the door creaked open. Inside was a small, cluttered room that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Old computers sat on desks covered in dust. Stacks of papers spilled over onto the floor, and reels of microfilm were piled haphazardly in the corners. "This is where Project Starlight operated," Agent Harris explained. "It hasn't been accessed in decades, but if there's anything left here that can help you understand what your father was working on, it's probably in this room." Karoline stepped inside, her eyes scanning the chaos around her. It was overwhelming, but also strangely exciting. Every object in the room held the potential to unlock a piece of the mystery. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work, sifting through the piles of documents and files. As she dug deeper, she found scraps of notes written in her father's familiar handwriting. Some were technical jargon she didn't understand, but others were personal reminders, almost like diary entries. One note in particular caught her attention. It was scribbled hastily on a torn piece of paper. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone. Trust no one, not even those closest to you." Below it was a series of numbers and symbols that looked like a code. Karoline's hands trembled as she held the note. Her father had known someone would come looking for answers someday. He had left her a trail to follow. And now, standing in this forgotten room surrounded by fragments of the past, she realized that her journey was only beginning. Karoline stared at the note in her hands, her mind racing. The words were simple, but their weight was enormous. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone. Trust no one, not even those closest to you." It was as if her father's voice was whispering directly to her across time, warning her of dangers she couldn't yet see. And then there was the code, a jumble of numbers and symbols that seemed meaningless at first glance. But Karoline knew better. Her father had always loved puzzles, riddles, and ciphers. He used to challenge her with them when she was a kid, teaching her how to think outside the box. This wasn't just random scribbling, it was a message meant for her. Agent Harris stood nearby, watching silently as Karoline examined the note. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Do you recognize any of this?" he asked finally, breaking the silence. Karoline nodded slowly. "The handwriting is definitely his," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "And these symbols, they look like something he'd use in one of his puzzles." Harris crossed his arms over his chest. "Your father was brilliant at what he did. If he left behind something like this, it's probably important. But decoding it won't be easy." "I can try," Karoline said firmly. She didn't have much choice. If she wanted answers, she had to start somewhere, and this felt like the best lead she'd get. For the next hour, Karoline pored over every scrap of paper in the room, searching for anything that might give context to the code. Some documents were technical and confusing, filled with terms she didn't understand. Others were fragments of conversations or memos, hinting at tensions within the team working on Project Starlight. One memo caught her eye. It mentioned a disagreement between her father and someone referred to only as Langston. The details were vague, but the tone suggested conflict. Who was Langston? Why had her father clashed with him? As she worked, Agent Harris occasionally chimed in with bits of information, though he seemed cautious about sharing too much. At one point he mentioned that Langston had been a consultant brought in during the later stages of the project. He was connected to some powerful people, Harris said cryptically. Some say he had ties to private corporations and government agencies alike. Karoline frowned. What kind of ties? Harris shrugged. That's above my pay grade. All I know is that Langston pushed for changes your father didn't agree with. After your father disappeared, Langston took over certain aspects of the project. That's all I can tell you. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was murky at best. Karoline sensed that Langston was key to understanding what had happened, but without more concrete evidence, it was impossible to say for sure. For now, she focused on the code. By the time evening rolled around, her head was spinning. She'd managed to jot down patterns from the sequence of numbers and symbols, but nothing clicked yet. Exhausted, she thanked Agent Harris for his help and left the FBI headquarters, clutching the note tightly in her hand. As she drove home, her thoughts kept circling back to her father. What had he been so afraid of? Why had he trusted her to uncover the truth after all these years? Back at her apartment, Karoline spread out everything she'd gathered on her kitchen table. The note, photocopies of relevant documents, and her own notes created a chaotic mosaic of clues. She poured herself a cup of coffee and settled in for a long night. Decoding puzzles had always been a mix of logic and intuition for her, and she approached this task with the same mindset. First, she studied the sequence carefully. The numbers ranged from single digits to three-digit figures, interspersed with symbols like asterisks and hash marks. Some sections repeated, while others appeared unique. Slowly, she began testing different possibilities. Was it a substitution cipher, where each number corresponded to a letter? Or was it something more complex, like coordinates or dates? Hours passed, and frustration mounted. Just as she was about to give up for the night, she noticed something peculiar. Certain groups of numbers matched patterns she recognized from old military codes her father used to teach her. Using those as a starting point, she started translating small chunks of the sequence. Bit by bit, the code began to unravel. When dawn broke, Karoline had cracked enough of the code to make her blood run cold. The decoded message revealed a list of names she didn't recognize at first glance. But as she cross-referenced them with the documents she'd seen at the FBI, she realized they weren't ordinary people. These were high-ranking officials, corporate executives, and influential figures in politics and technology. Each name was followed by brief descriptions: surveillance contracts approved, media manipulation authorized, blackmail material secured. Her hands trembled as she read through the list. It painted a chilling picture of corruption and power abuse. Someone, or some group, had been using Project Starlight not to protect national security, as she'd initially assumed, but to control and manipulate public opinion. And her father had apparently uncovered this conspiracy, which might explain why he'd vanished. But one name stood out among the rest: Victor Langston. According to the decoded message, he was at the center of it all. Not only had he orchestrated many of the operations, but he also had connections to nearly everyone else on the list. Langston wasn't just a consultant. He was the puppet master pulling strings from the shadows. Karoline leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by what she'd discovered. This wasn't just about her father anymore. It was bigger than that. Much bigger. She felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. If Langston was still alive and powerful, then exposing him wouldn't be easy. People who played games like this didn't take kindly to threats to their empire. Still, she knew what she had to do next. She couldn't let this go. Her father had risked everything to leave behind this trail, trusting her to carry the torch. She owed it to him and to herself to see it through. With a deep breath, she picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd saved earlier. An independent journalist she'd met once at a community event. If anyone could help her bring this story to light, it was him. As the phone rang, Karoline stared out the window at the rising sun. The road ahead would be dangerous, but she was ready. Whatever came next, she wouldn't back down. The phone call with the journalist went better than Karoline expected. His name was Sam, and though they'd only met briefly at a local event months ago, he seemed genuinely interested in hearing her story. When she explained what she'd uncovered, her father's mysterious past, the cryptic note, the coded message, and the list of powerful names tied to Project Starlight, Sam didn't dismiss her claims or treat them as conspiracy theories. Instead, his tone shifted from casual curiosity to serious determination. "This is huge," he said after a long pause. "If even half of what you're saying is true, we're talking about something that could blow the lid off decades of corruption. But we need proof, solid evidence. Leaks like this don't come without risks." Karoline nodded even though he couldn't see her through the phone. She knew exactly what he meant. This wasn't just about exposing wrongdoing. It was about staying alive while doing it. Still, she couldn't back down now. Not when she'd come so far. "I'll do whatever it takes," she told him firmly. "I have the decoded message and some documents from the FBI vault. They might not be enough on their own, but if we dig deeper, maybe we can find more." Sam agreed to meet her later that day at a quiet cafe downtown. It was neutral ground, away from prying eyes. As she hung up the phone, Karoline felt a mix of relief and dread. Having an ally made her feel less alone, but she also knew that involving someone else put them both in danger. Trust no one, her father had written, but how could she uncover the truth entirely by herself? When Karoline arrived at the cafe, Sam was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a laptop open in front of him. He looked up as she approached, giving her a small smile. There was something reassuring about his calm demeanor, like he'd been through situations like this before and knew how to handle them. "Thanks for coming," Karoline said as she slid into the seat across from him. She pulled out the folder, containing copies of the decoded message and other notes she'd made. "Here's everything I've got so far." Sam scanned the papers quickly, his brow furrowing as he read. "This is intense," he murmured. "These names are heavy. Hitters. If we go public with this, it won't just ruffle feathers, it'll start a firestorm. That's why we need to be careful," Karoline replied. "But I don't think we have much time. Whoever's behind this, they'll know eventually that I'm onto them. My father disappeared because of this. I can't let the same thing happen to me." Sam leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the table thoughtfully. "Okay, here's what we need to do. First, we verify every single name on this list. Cross-reference them with public records, financial disclosures, anything we can get our hands on. Second, we look for patterns, connections between these people and any ongoing scandals or controversies. Third," he hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Third, we figure out who Victor Langston really is. Because if he's the mastermind, then taking him down will unravel the whole operation." Karoline nodded. The plan sounded straightforward enough, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. Digging into the lives of powerful people came with its own set of challenges and dangers. Still, she trusted Sam's instincts. He seemed sharp, resourceful, and most importantly, willing to stick by her side. Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly, dividing tasks between them. Karoline focused on tracing Langston's history, combing through old news articles, business filings, and social media profiles. What she found painted a troubling picture. Langston wasn't just a tech mogul. He was a shadowy figure with ties to government contracts, surveillance programs, and media conglomerates. His company, StarTech Industries, had grown rapidly over the past 3 decades, acquiring smaller firms and expanding its reach into nearly every aspect of modern life. But beneath the polished exterior lay whispers of unethical practices, illegal data harvesting, blackmail schemes, and covert partnerships with intelligence agencies. Meanwhile, Sam tackled the names on the list, piecing together a web of connections that stretched across industries and continents. One executive was linked to a bribery scandal in Europe. Another had funneled money into offshore accounts tied to political campaigns. Each discovery added another layer to the conspiracy, confirming what Karoline had suspected all along. Project Starlight hadn't ended when her father disappeared. It had evolved, morphed into something far more sinister. Despite their progress, paranoia began to creep in. Karoline started noticing strange things. Cars parked outside her apartment for hours, unfamiliar faces lingering near her workplace, missed calls from unknown numbers late at night. At first, she tried to brush it off as coincidence, but deep down, she knew better. Someone was watching her. One evening, as she walked home from meeting Sam, she spotted a black sedan trailing her at a distance. Her heart pounded in her chest as she quickened her pace, ducking into a crowded store to lose whoever was following her. She stayed inside for nearly an hour, pretending to browse shelves until she was certain the car was gone. By the time she finally reached her apartment, her nerves were frayed. She called Sam immediately. "They're onto us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw a car following me tonight. I don't think it's safe anymore." Sam's tone was grim but resolute. "We need to move faster. If they're closing in, we can't afford to wait. Let's compile everything we have and release it all at once. We'll hit them where it hurts, expose their secrets before they can silence us." Though terrified, Karoline agreed. They spent the next 48 hours working nonstop, pulling together every shred of evidence they'd gathered. Documents, photos, decoded messages. All of it was uploaded to secure servers and backed up multiple times to ensure it couldn't be destroyed. Finally, when they were ready, Sam published the exposé online under a pseudonym, making sure it spread across social media platforms and independent news outlets simultaneously. Within hours, the internet exploded. The article went viral, sparking outrage and disbelief. People demanded answers, calling for investigations into the individuals and corporations named in the report. Law enforcement agencies launched inquiries, and journalists scrambled to verify the claims. For the first time in years, the powerful elite were forced to answer for their actions. But for Karoline, the victory felt bittersweet. Sitting alone in her apartment, staring at the screen filled with headlines about Project Starlight, she couldn't help but think of her father. Had he envisioned this moment? Had he hoped someone would finish what he started? A knock at the door startled her out of her thoughts. Cautiously, she opened it to find Sam standing there holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use this," he said with a small smile. "You did good, Karoline. Your dad would be proud." Tears welled up in her eyes as she stepped aside to let him in. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe. The fight wasn't over, not completely, but she'd taken the first step toward justice. And that was enough for now. The days following the exposé were a whirlwind of chaos and fear. The article had sent shockwaves through the nation, igniting debates on social media, news channels, and even in Congress. People were outraged, demanding accountability from the powerful figures named in the report. Investigations were launched, arrests were made, and corporate giants scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. But for Karoline, the victory felt hollow. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. It started with little things, her phone acting strangely, calls dropping unexpectedly, or texts arriving garbled. Then came the emails, anonymous threats warning her to stop digging. One message simply read, "You've gone too far. Walk away while you still can." Karoline deleted it immediately but couldn't ignore the chill running down her spine. Whoever was behind this wasn't playing games. They meant business. Sam noticed the change in her demeanor during one of their late-night meetings at his apartment. He'd set up a secure workspace there, complete with encrypted laptops and burner phones to avoid any potential surveillance. They were reviewing new leads when he finally broke the silence. "You're not sleeping, are you?" Sam asked, his voice soft but firm. Karoline shook her head, avoiding his gaze. "How can I? Every time I close my eyes, I think about what they might do next. What if they come after us?" "They won't," Sam said quickly, though his tone betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "We've been careful. Everything we've done is untraceable. Even if they try to retaliate, the truth is already out there. You've done your part." But Karoline wasn't convinced. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Trust no one. She trusted Sam. He'd proven himself trustworthy, but she couldn't help wondering how long that would last. Could anyone truly be relied upon when the stakes were this high? Despite her fears, they pressed on. With the initial wave of public outrage fading slightly, they decided to focus on Victor Langston. If anyone could provide concrete proof of the conspiracy, it was him. Sam suggested arranging a face-to-face meeting under the guise of a job interview. StarTech Industries was always looking for skilled professionals, and Karoline's background in data analysis made her a credible candidate. It's risky, Sam admitted as they prepared for the encounter. But if we play our cards right, you might get close enough to gather something tangible, something undeniable. Karoline agreed reluctantly. Risky or not, it was their best shot at getting answers. The thought of sitting across from Langston filled her with dread, but she reminded herself why she was doing this. For her father, for justice, and for everyone else who had suffered because of Project Starlight. The day of the interview arrived, and Karoline dressed professionally, trying to mask her anxiety beneath a calm exterior. As she entered the sleek, glass-walled headquarters of StarTech Industries, she felt out of place among the polished employees bustling around her. The receptionist greeted her warmly and escorted her to a conference room where Langston awaited. Victor. Langston was nothing like she'd imagined. Tall and impeccably dressed, he exuded charm and confidence. His sharp features and piercing eyes gave him an almost magnetic presence. Yet there was something unsettling about him, a coldness lurking beneath the surface. Ms. Leavitt, he said smoothly, extending a hand. Thank you for coming in today. Karoline forced a smile and shook his hand, her grip steady despite the storm raging inside her. Thank you for having me, Mr. Langston. They spent the next hour discussing her qualifications and experience, with Langston asking probing questions about her work history and skills. Karoline answered carefully, sticking to rehearsed responses while subtly steering the conversation toward Project Starlight. When she mentioned cryptography and government contracts, Langston's expression flickered briefly, a fleeting moment of unease that confirmed her suspicions. I see, he said, leaning back in his chair. That's quite an impressive resume. Tell me, Ms. Leavitt, have you ever encountered ethical dilemmas in your line of work? The question caught her off guard, but she recovered quickly. Of course. Ethics are important in every field, especially when dealing with sensitive information. It's crucial to know where to draw the line. Langston studied her for a moment, his lips curling into a faint smile. Very wise. I'll be sure to keep that in mind. By the end of the interview, Karoline was exhausted but hopeful. She hadn't uncovered anything groundbreaking, but the subtle reactions she'd observed gave her enough material to work with. As she left the building, she couldn't shake the feeling that Langston knew exactly who she was and why she was there. Back. At Sam's apartment, they reviewed the details of the meeting. Karoline recounted every word, every gesture, searching for clues. Something about Langston's demeanor bothered her. It was as if he were testing her, gauging how much she knew. He's onto us, Karoline said flatly. I don't know how, but he knows. Sam frowned, pacing the room. Then we need to act fast. We can't afford to wait any longer. Let's compile everything we've gathered so far, every document, every photo, every piece of evidence, and release it all, at once. Flood the internet with it. Make it impossible for them to cover it up. Karoline nodded, though her stomach churned with nerves. This was it, the final push. Once they went public, there would be no turning back. But she also knew they couldn't let fear dictate their actions. Too much was at stake. Over the next 48 hours, they worked non-stop, poring over files and organizing them into a cohesive narrative. They included transcripts of intercepted communications, financial records linking Langston to illegal activities, and testimonies from former employees who had witnessed unethical practices firsthand. To protect themselves, they uploaded the entire dossier to multiple independent servers around the world, ensuring it couldn't be erased. Finally, when everything was ready, Sam hit publish. Within minutes, the story exploded online. News outlets picked it up, Politicians demanded investigations and protests erupted outside StarTech's offices. For the first time in decades, the shadowy empire built by Victor Langston began to crumble. But as Karoline sat alone in her apartment later that night, staring at the glowing screen of her laptop, she realized the fight wasn't over. Langston was still out there, untouchable for now. And she knew that exposing the truth was only the beginning. Justice would require more than headlines. It would take courage, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to holding power accountable. For the first time in weeks, Karoline allowed herself a small smile. No matter what happened next, she had honored her father's legacy, and that was worth everything. The fallout from the second expose was swift and brutal. Within hours, Victor Langston's empire began to unravel. Reporters swarmed his offices, demanding statements. Politicians who had once praised him now distanced themselves publicly, claiming ignorance of his alleged crimes. Employees defected in droves, some even coming forward with their own stories of corruption and intimidation. The media frenzy reached a fever pitch, and for a brief moment, it seemed like justice might finally prevail. But Karoline knew better. While the public celebrated the takedown of a powerful figure, she couldn't shake the feeling that Langston wasn't done fighting. Men like him didn't fall easily. They clawed their way back, often dragging others down with them. And sure enough, just as the dust seemed to settle, things took a darker turn. It started with a phone call late one night. Karoline had been dozing on her couch, exhausted from weeks of relentless work, when the shrill ring of her burner phone jolted her awake. She hesitated before answering, dread pooling in her stomach. When she finally picked up, the voice on the other end was distorted, almost mechanical. "You think you've won?" it rasped. "This isn't over. You've made enemies you can't even imagine." Karoline's grip tightened around the phone. "Who is this?" she demanded, though she already suspected the answer. The caller chuckled darkly. "Does it matter? Just know this. If you keep pushing, you'll regret it. Walk away while you still can." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, her mind racing. This wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration of war. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to let her expose them without a fight. She called Sam immediately. He answered on the first ring, his tone tense but alert. "What happened?" "They contacted me," Karoline said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They warned me to stop." There was a long pause on the other end. "Are you okay? Did they say anything specific?" No names, nothing concrete, but it was clear who they were talking about. Langston, or whoever he works for, they're not backing down. Sam exhaled sharply. "We need to be smarter about this. If they're willing to threaten you directly, then we're dealing with people who don't care about rules or consequences. We have to protect ourselves." Over the next few days, they implemented new security measures. They ditched their burner phones and switched to encrypted messaging apps. Sam rented a storage unit under a fake name to store physical copies of their evidence, ensuring they'd always have a backup. They also agreed to limit their movements, staying off social media and avoiding places where they could be easily tracked. Despite these precautions, paranoia crept into every aspect of Karoline's life. She stopped sleeping properly, jumping at every sound outside her window. Shadows seemed to move in ways they shouldn't, and strangers felt suspicious even in broad daylight. It was exhausting, but she refused to give in to fear. Her father had trusted her to see this through, and she wouldn't let him or herself down. Then came the betrayal. It happened during a routine meeting with Agent Harris. Karoline had reached out to him again, hoping to gather more information about Project Starlight's remaining loose ends. To her surprise, he agreed to meet her at a quiet park near the FBI headquarters. As they sat on a bench surrounded by autumn leaves, she shared her concerns about the threats she'd received. Harris listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ms. Leavitt. People involved in this conspiracy are untouchable. They have resources you can't even fathom. If I were you, I'd walk away while you still can." His words echoed eerily, similar to the ones she'd heard on the phone. Alarm bells rang in her head. "What are you saying?" she asked cautiously. "Are you telling me to stop?" Harris hesitated, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Let's just say there's pressure coming from higher-ups. Questions being asked. About you. About me. About why we're so interested in something that should have stayed buried." Karoline stared at him, her heart sinking. "You're involved in this, aren't you? That's why you're warning me. To cover your tracks." Harris didn't deny it. Instead, he stood up abruptly, brushing imaginary dirt off his suit. "I'm just giving you advice, Ms. Leavitt. Take it or leave it. But remember, one wrong move and you'll find yourself in deeper than you can handle." As he walked away, Karoline felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She'd trusted Harris, relied on him for guidance. Now she realized he was part of the web she was trying to untangle. Betrayal stung worse than fear because it meant she truly was alone. That night, she confided in Sam. Sitting in his dimly lit apartment, she recounted the conversation with Harris, tears streaming down her face. "He sold us out," she choked out. "He's one of them." Sam wrapped an arm around her shoulders, offering silent comfort. "We knew this wouldn't be easy," he said gently. "People like Harris, they play both sides until it benefits them, but that doesn't mean we give up. We adapt. We survive." Karoline nodded, wiping her eyes. "What do we do now?" "We go underground," Sam replied firmly. "No more meetings, no more calls unless absolutely necessary. We focus on gathering everything we need to take them down completely. Once we have irrefutable proof, we release it all at once. No holds barred." For the first time since Harris's betrayal, Karoline felt a flicker of hope. They weren't defeated yet. Not by a long shot. With renewed determination, they hunkered down, combing through old files and reaching out to whistleblowers willing to share damning evidence. Each new piece of information brought them closer to their goal, but it also heightened the danger. One evening, as they reviewed the latest batch of documents, Karoline looked up at Sam. "Do you ever wonder what happens after this? If we actually succeed, I mean." Sam smiled faintly. "I think about it sometimes. A world where truth matters again, where power isn't abused. It's worth fighting for, don't you think?" Karoline nodded slowly. Yeah, it is." And with that, they returned to their work, knowing the road ahead would be treacherous but determined to see it through to the end. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place on a cold gray morning. Karoline and Sam had spent weeks gathering evidence, connecting dots, and preparing for what they hoped would be the decisive blow against Victor Langston and his shadowy network. By now, their lives had become a blur of sleepless nights, endless cups of coffee, and whispered conversations in dimly lit rooms. They were running out of time, and they both knew it. Karoline sat at Sam's cluttered kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of documents, laptop screens glowing faintly in the low light. Her eyes burned from staring at them for hours, but she refused to stop. She sifted through one last batch of files, a trove of emails and financial records leaked by a former StarTech employee who had grown disillusioned with the company's unethical practices. Buried deep within those documents was something she hadn't expected: a detailed ledger outlining illegal transactions between Langston and several high-ranking government officials. It wasn't just corruption. It was treason. "This is it," Karoline said, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and dread as she handed the printout to Sam. "This proves everything. Langston didn't just manipulate public opinion or steal data. He worked directly with people in power to undermine democracy itself." Sam scanned the pages quickly, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the implications. "It's enough to bring down an entire system," he muttered. "But releasing this, it's going to make enemies everywhere, not just Langston. Everyone connected to him will come after us." "I know," Karoline replied softly, "but we don't have a choice anymore. If we don't do this, no one else will." The plan was simple yet risky. They would release the ledger along with every other piece of evidence they'd gathered over the past months, all at once, flooding the internet with so much information that it would be impossible to suppress. To ensure maximum impact, they coordinated with independent journalists, activists, and whistleblower organizations around the world. Every file was uploaded to secure servers, encrypted, and distributed across multiple platforms. Even if someone tried to delete it, copies would remain hidden, ready to resurface. As they worked, paranoia lingered like a shadow. Karoline couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even in the safety of Sam's apartment. She checked the windows constantly, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by restless pacing and endless planning. Still, she pressed on, driven by the memory of her father's cryptic note. Trust no one, not even those closest to you. Those words echoed in her mind, a grim reminder of how far-reaching the conspiracy truly was. Finally, the day arrived. At exactly midnight, they hit publish. Within minutes, the internet exploded. News outlets scrambled to cover the story. Governments issued denials, and social media erupted with outrage. The sheer volume of evidence overwhelmed any attempt to discredit it. For the first time, the full scope of Project Starlight and its evolution into a tool of oppression was laid bare for the world to see. Victor Langston disappeared almost immediately. His assets were frozen, his companies raided, and warrants issued for his arrest. But Karoline knew better than to celebrate too soon. Langston was a survivor, and survivors always had contingency plans. Still, the damage had been done. His empire was crumbling, and the individuals tied to him were scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. In the days that followed, life began to return to some semblance of normalcy, or as close to normal as it could get after such an ordeal. Karoline moved apartments, choosing a quieter neighborhood where she felt less exposed. She avoided using technology unless absolutely necessary, opting instead for handwritten notes and face-to-face meetings when possible. Trusting others remained difficult, but she found solace in knowing she had done the right thing. Sam stayed by her side throughout it all, offering support and encouragement. Together they monitored the aftermath of the exposé, watching as investigations unfolded and justice slowly took shape. It wasn't perfect. Some powerful figures managed to evade accountability, but progress was undeniable. The truth had a way of cutting through lies no matter how deeply entrenched they were. One evening, as they sat together on a park bench overlooking the city skyline, Karoline finally allowed herself to reflect on everything that had happened. The fear, the betrayal, the sacrifices. It had all led to this moment. She turned to Sam, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think my dad knew how big this was?" she asked quietly. "That he left me those clues because he believed I could finish what he started?" Sam nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely. He trusted you to carry the torch. And look at what you've done. You've honored his memory in the best way possible." Tears welled up in Karoline's eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pride, for her father, for herself, and for everyone who had dared to stand up against injustice. She gazed out at the horizon where the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. It felt symbolic somehow, like a new chapter was unfolding, not just for her, but for the world. Though the fight wasn't entirely over, Karoline knew she had made a difference. Justice wasn't something that could be achieved overnight. It required persistence, courage, and sacrifice. She had faced her fears head-on, refusing to back down even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And in doing so, she had uncovered the truth, not just about her father, but about the systems that governed society. As she walked home that night, the weight of the past few months lifted slightly. She still carried scars, emotional and psychological, but they reminded her of how far she had come. Her journey had changed her, shaping her into someone stronger, braver, and more determined than ever before. Standing outside her apartment building, she looked up at the stars twinkling faintly in the night sky. Somewhere, she hoped her father was watching, proud of the legacy she had uncovered. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. Because sometimes, the smallest voices can challenge the biggest lies and change the world forever.